Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Charles West, who has a personal chair in medieval history at the School of History, Classics, and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. Before Edinburgh, he studied at Cambridge and the University of Birmingham and has held positions in Sheffield, Oxford, Paris, and beyond. His areas of interest include, to borrow from your website, the Carolingian Empire, relationships between religious and secular societies and hierarchies, as well as the living conditions and political agency of the peasant class in medieval times. And this morning, he is taking us to the 11th century to tell us about European queens. So please welcome Professor West.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be initiated into the Dunnett verse here today, and also great to be in I was going to say sunny Dumfries. That might be too much to ask for, but at least it's not raining, and it's a very beautiful campus, isn't it? So wonderful to be here. Let me begin, if I may, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, with a game of chess. Or in fact, rather with the game of chess. Around the year 1000, chess was introduced into Northern Europe from the Islamic world. It seems to have first arrived in Al-Andalus, so that's, say, Muslim Spain, and then moved north from there, although it may have arrived independently also via southern Italy. Now, there survives a guide to how to play chess, written in Latin verse in the Swiss monastery of Einsiedeln, also around the year 1000, called the Versus de Skakis. And I wonder if, there we go. Oh, let me move through the slides. There we go. Which means a poem about chess. And this poem shows that the rules of chess were actually much the same in Europe as they had been in Baghdad, or for that matter in the courts of India, where chess was invented. But the Einsiedeln poem also, though, reveals some changes had been made to how the game was played in the nature of the chess pieces. So, in other words, when this game arrives in the north, certain adaptations are made to the chess pieces to adapt it to its new social context. So what had been, for example, a chariot becomes a tower, right? In other words, today, the castle. And rook, of course, as many of you may know, means chariot in Persian, in fact. And that's because Western armies did not usually have chariots. The elephant, they didn't have those either, becomes a bishop, although in French actually becomes a fool or a jester, and again, that's because there weren't really elephants. But maybe most interesting for our purpose is what happens to the ruler's chief advisor, who is the vizier in the original game, because the vizier changes gender and becomes a queen. And that is, in fact, the moment when a female piece is introduced for the first time onto the board. And as the Einsiedeln text says, and the Latin is in fact there for you, but I can provide you with a translation, the warriors of the first rank hold the first line of the field already described, divided into 8, so those are the pawns. The king and the queen are placed in the middle, alike in appearance but not in scope. Okay, so in other words, we can see in this text that the queen is now part of this chessboard in Europe. Now, of course, the Einsiedeln verse it's a poem. It's describing how things ought to be played. It's not in itself evidence of how people played chess, but there do survive plenty of evidence for chess pieces from the Middle Ages, which confirm this transformation. And to give you some of them here, here are 2 queens from the very well-known Lewis chess set. I'm sure you've seen these before. There are a couple of pieces in Edinburgh and many more in London. It's 13th century, of course, but there are also some 11th century ones too, including these very impressive and very stately queens from an 11th century southern Italian workshop, which are now on display in Paris. If you get a chance, go and have a look at them. And so I think my argument here is that through chess, we can see something of the symbolic importance of queens. Right, in Europe, and their role as symbolic partners to kings. Okay, so the fact there had been the game of chess had been updated to take their position into account tells us something. Right, so that's in a way my first point. But before we go any further, let me give you a little bit of background. This paper is an offshoot of my research in a forthcoming book. Quick plug here. Alas, no cover picture on 11th century Europe as a whole, forthcoming with Oxford. Now, every century has claims to fame, of course, but the 11th century is often defined and identified as a moment when Europe is made. Right, that's a kind of common thing people say about it. In a very famous and rightly famous book from 1994, the historian Robert Bartlett, who you may have come across, frames this process as the Europeanization of Europe. Right, so kind of sense of a standardization, almost homogenization, when a degree of consistency is achieved for the first time across the continent. It's a great book, and it's inspired many, many students, and there's a picture of it, and has set the intellectual agenda in lots of ways. And I would say it's probably one of the most influential history books written over the past half century. But it's very noticeable that in this very good book on the making of Europe, and in work it has inspired, the concentration has been on men. Right? The making of Europe is either about military conquest, right? Battles, very important, of course, conquests, invasions, so forth, or it's about churchmen and church reform, and then we're talking about popes. And of course, today is a very good day to be talking about popes, isn't it? But either way, we're talking about a kind of aggressive male colonization in one format or another, right? In one sphere or another, whether in the clerical or the secular sphere. And actually, the German translation of Robert Bartlett's book brought this out. You'll see it says, the birth of Europe aus dem Geist der Gewalt, which means kind of from the spirit of violence, right? That might tell you something about the translator, perhaps, but it does actually also connect to something in the book, I think. So in this paper, I want to shift, really, to think about the making of Europe from a different perspective, specifically then from the perspective of women and queens. A lot can be said, a lot has been said about 11th century queens. University library bookshelves are groaning with books on the topic, with important scholarship too. This tends to focus on individual queens, or it focuses on the changing role of queenship as a whole, which goes back actually to pioneering work in the 1960s. Historians have worked very hard to ensure that women are featured in the historic analysis of this period as active agents, of course, doing their own thing, shaping what happens, and not as passive pawns, if you'll excuse the reference to chess again. But what interests me for today about queens is their mobility. Okay, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Because the mobility of queens is much greater than that of kings. Kings tended, with some exceptions, to stay put, right? And you can think of some exceptions. Canute is a great exception, but still, on the whole, they stayed put. They generally, as a rule, inherited the kingdom they had been born in, and maybe they tried to conquer a bit more on the side, right? But as a rule, they stayed put. Queens, completely the opposite, right? As a rule, queens moved. They moved to marry and take on their new role in a different country as a matter of routine. And they did so especially from the 11th century. So in other words, they were very often immigrants or emigrants, depending on your perspective. And this is the perspective I want to consider in the rest of this paper. And I will come back to chess at the end. But as a first step, let us have some life stories. Because I'm talking about patterns and trends, but I'm also talking about individuals, people with their own aspirations, their own fears, and I wouldn't want that to be lost sight of. So I'm going to give you 4 interesting women who moved, right, as queens, as a kind of, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Perhaps the most famous, or maybe not, I don't know, but perhaps the most famous of the moving queens of my long 11th century is the Greek-speaking Theophanu, okay, who travelled from Constantinople in Byzantium to marry Emperor Otto II of Germany in 972. Now, the history of attempts to broker marriage alliances between the Western Emperor, the kind of descendants of Charlemagne, and the Eastern Empire based on Constantinople, go back a long way. They actually go back to Charlemagne himself. But Theophanu's marriage is one of the very few which actually came off. She was not herself a porphyrogenitor. She was not actually born in the purple to a reigning emperor. But she was a relative of the reigning emperor, of the Byzantine imperial family, and that was good enough for the emperor in the West, right? You know, that was enough cachet for them. This is arranged actually for Otto II by his father Otto I, but he dies very soon actually, leaving Otto II and Theophanu as his heirs. But then Otto II dies, in fact, after only a decade, and Theophanu acts as a regent. You know, this Greek-educated woman is the regent for the Western Empire for a while, actually, for a few years at least, ruling on behalf of her young sons until her own death fairly early probably she was only in her 40s. And on the screen, if you can see it, by the way, is a picture from her marriage charter written in golding kind of purple background, as you would expect for an empress. A second example. Later Western emperors remained interested in Byzantium and in marriages with Byzantium. And in fact, one was lined up for Theophanu's, one such marriage alliance was lined up for Theophanu's son, Otto III. Unfortunately, he died too young for it to happen. But these marriages were difficult to arrange, actually, and most imperial wives came from elsewhere. And a particularly interesting example is Empress Agnes, who you see here on the screen. In fact, you really do see here is the portrait of her next to her husband beneath the Virgin Mary. Now, Agnes is often known as Agnes of Poitou because Poitou, in southwestern France, of course, was where she was born and raised. She left her homeland to marry the Emperor Henry III, the German Emperor Henry III, in 1046. Like Theophanu, she was a very prominent figure in her own lifetime. And there's a couple of images like this, actually, where she's shown alongside, really as the emperor's consort, right? And these equal figures, yeah? And they're portrayed as such in a number of manuscripts from the time. Yeah, so this is a kind of a marriage of partnership. And actually, like Theophanu, when her husband died, Agnes also acts as regent, ruling again on behalf of her son, before she steps down to retire. And interestingly, she retires not to France, but to Rome, where she spends a decade, in fact, from around 1065 until her death, basically living as a holy, not as a nun, but as a kind of living a holy life around the Holy See. Although she does occasionally pop back to see her son, although only actually when the Pope has something he wants her to do, interestingly. But anyway, now, I would not want to give the impression it's only empresses who moved. That would not be right. So here is a third example, much less well known, I think, but very interesting. And this is a near contemporary of Agnes, a woman called Gertrude. Now, Gertrude was born into the Polish royal family. She's the daughter of King Mieszko II and his wife Rycheza. And aged about 20, in 1043, Gertrude travels to Kiev, Rus, where she marries a man called Izyaslav, who's often called in literature, by the way, a prince, but he's a king, in fact. Right? And actually, contemporary sources talk of him as a king. She spends 20 years in Rus as a queen before both she and her husband are then exiled back to Poland because of the political turmoil. A few years later, though, they get back to Kiev, and although the politics remain stormy, she stays and I think dies in Russia, or Russia, I should say. My final example, I think, is close to home, and I'm sure you'll have all heard of her. How can I not talk about Queen Margaret of Scotland, of course? Margaret of Scotland is sometimes known as Margaret of Wessex because she was born into the West Saxon royal family, but she was born into a branch of that family in exile. So she's born, her father was a grandson of King Athelred the Unready, but her mother, Agatha, was probably German, although we don't quite know about that, but very likely. So in 1057, a very young Margaret returns, so to speak, to England, which she's never actually seen, along with her brother Edgar. As you probably know, a decade later, the Norman conquest of England means that she needs to find a new home, and she finds it, of course, in Scotland, where she goes on to marry King Malcolm III around 1070, and spends the next 3 decades or so of her life, well, the rest of her life, in fact, in Scotland. There is, I'm afraid, no contemporary picture of Margaret, but I can show you a picture of her gospel book, which we know she owned, and which is today in Oxford, if I remember correctly, and which is said to have, she's said to have dropped it into a river once, but it miraculously came out dry, and it certainly seems in pretty good nick. Now, these 4 queens are but a selection from a much larger number. Right? There are many other 11th century emigrating queens who are equally famous and interesting. Anna of Kiev, for example, who goes from Kiev to France, in fact, becomes the Queen of France, or Maria Argyropoulos, a Byzantine bride who goes to Venice and is often thought to have introduced the fork to Venice. As you know, the sophistication of the height of sophistication at the time, and people criticise over it, by the way. Or Judith of Hungary, who, as her name suggests, becomes Queen of Hungary. Or Gisela of Bavaria, who ends up as the queen in Hungary, actually, it goes the other way. Or Gunhild of Denmark, who is Scandinavian, who goes to Germany. And we might also add Emma of Normandy, by the way, a little closer to home. And, of course, a Norwegian princess named Grubba, who moves to Orkney and then to Scotland. All these people are interesting. But what's interesting about the 4 ones I have talked about, the 4 ones I've highlighted today, is that in every case, these women are explicitly associated by contemporaries or near contemporaries with accelerating cultural change. Okay, so these women are special because we happen to know that contemporaries wrote about them having an impact on where they arrived. Okay, so that's why these four, that's why I've highlighted these four. So let me tell you a little bit about that. If we begin with theophany, to go back to my Byzantine empress, Western empress, she features theophany in a collection of visions put together by a mid-11th century Bavarian monk named Otto of St. Emmeram, whose name is on the screen. According to Otto, a certain nun, and Otto says, I've forgotten who she was, by the way, which is a bit suspicious, but anyway, a certain nun has a vision in which a distressed Empress Theophany, after her death this is, appears to this nun in her sleep. In the vision, Theophany says, well, I am the Empress Theophany and I've come and I need your prayers. And the nun says, well, yes, but what's the problem? Why do you need my prayers? Theophany replied she was suffering because, and this I quote, Theophany said, I brought here for the first time many unnecessary and decadent women's ornaments, which the Greeks are accustomed to using, but which were unknown in the regions of Germany and France. This is bad, it gets worse. Not only that, I made other women sin because they wanted them too. And worse still, she hadn't even realised that this taste for expensive, showy jewellery was sinful, which is why she hadn't done penance for it whilst alive, right? She thought it was just great when she was alive. Only now, as she's in the other world, as she realised what a mistake that was. And we might think here, by the way, when she talks of this jewellery, with the very impressive Gisela Schmuck, as it's called, a kind of the Gisela jewellery of Byzantine-inspired jewellery found in Mainz, no direct connection to theophany, but this is the sort of thing she was talking about, right, to give you a sense of it. Or at least when I say she or the nun, or maybe Otto of St. Emmeram, that was what he was thinking of. Now, Empress Agnes, to move on to her, came in for some pretty similar style of criticism, actually, at around the same time, although in her case it was pre rather than post-mortem. In 1043, just before her marriage to Emperor Henry III was arranged, an abbot named Siegfried of Gors, which is now near the town of Metz in France, tried to block it. Right. In a letter he wrote to a fellow abbot, Siegfried expressed his concern. Ostensibly his concern was that Agnes and Henry were too closely related to be allowed to marry. Okay, so he said this would be incestuous, it must be stopped. And actually he provided a family tree to prove the point. Right, to show that these dynasties were too closely linked for the marriage to go ahead, which is, I think, very interesting for us in terms of thinking about how much dynastic knowledge there was at the time. But he ends his letter with another point, and I'm going to quote it at length because it is on the screen, but it's quite small, about French influence in the German Empire. So I'm here. Let me quote Abbot Siegfried. There is one thing which upsets me greatly, and which I cannot allow to pass over in silence. That is about the honour of the kingdom, the honestas regni in Latin. In the times of previous emperors, this honour flourished very properly in clothing and in comportment in arms and horse riding. But in our days, this has been put in second place, and the ignominious customs of French ineptitudes have been introduced in the shaving of beards, in the shameful shortening and deforming of garments, and in many other novelties which it would take too long to list, and whose introduction was forbidden in the time of the Ottos and the Henrys, so the emperors preceding. But today many people despise the honest customs of our fathers, and they seek the clothing and at the same time and very quickly the perversities of foreigners. Through all this they wish to be similar to those they know to be enemies and traitors, and what is to be lamented even more, such people are not only chastised but are even treated as close companions by kings and other princes, and everyone receives a greater reward the more promptly they copy these stupidities. The others see this and do not blush to copy them, and because they see that they're tolerated and rewarded, they rush to think up even greater insanities. For these and other things, O Father, I agree very greatly, since with these foreign changes we see, with these foreign changes, so too customs change, and we see in a kingdom hitherto more honourable than others that murders, rapine, perjury, betrayal, and various deceptions are gradually increasing, and we fear that these are the signs of greater ills. Okay, so Quite a passage. He doesn't here mention Agnes directly, by the way, but he leaves the reader to draw the connection, to put two and two together. For Siegfried, Agnes's imminent arrival at the German court is associated what he sees as a very negatively as a Frenchification of a once noble German court. Right. So that is they're very much connected. Gertrude doesn't fit quite so well here, but it's her case is too good to miss out entirely. And for most of what I'm going to be talking about here, I rely on the work of a Ukrainian historian named Talia Zajac, who's writing a full-scale study of Gertrude, which will be brilliant. At some point in the 1080s, the Metropolitan Patriarch of Kiev, someone called Ioan II, wrote that religiously orthodox rulers should not marry their children to Catholics, he says. Because he says, to give the daughters of the noblest ruler as brides to nations who partake of azymes, that's say unleavened bread, unleavened communion bread or mass, is unworthy and very unseemly. Now, he focuses here on this religious ritual and on marriages going that way, but there's some reasons to think that he would have been just as worried by the case of Gertrude, whose marriage took her into that religious sphere. And that reason concerns her prayer book, which is now held in Cividale in Italy. And there's a picture of it here on the screen. It's a very interesting manuscript, actually, because it was already old by the time Gertrude owned it. It was actually 10th century. It's an Ottonian manuscript, which is an heirloom, 100 years old by the time it came into her own hands. And she then goes on to amend and illustrate it, actually, once she has it as her own personal book. And amongst these changes, she copies dozens of new personal prayers into it, into her own prayer book. Several of these concern, they concern all kinds of things actually, but several of them concern anxieties and fears about her son, who's a man called Peter. And let me quote to you from one of the prayers that's not on the slide. She prays to St. Helena. St. Helena, who asked that the Lord might send his angel to your son Constantine and warn him to aim for and do everything that your soul desired, and that was your will, I, a sinner, beseech you and wish that you pray to God that he may send his angel to my son, so that he might not resist my will and will follow my advice. Right? So she's essentially saying, Helena, you got Constantine to do what you wanted. Teach me how to do that. Right? Let's see if we can do that. Gertrude was a woman who had her own views, and she wanted her son to follow them as well. But actually, these prayers also concern various kind of theological Trinitarian formulations, which would almost certainly have raised Orthodox eyebrows, so just the kind of thing that would, I think, have worried the Patriarch Ioan II. My final example of talking about these kinds of changes which these queens introduced comes back to Margaret, so back to Scotland. If I can make the slide click, there we go. Right. There we go. In fact, the prayer was on the slide, but never mind, you've heard it. So, yes, on to Margaret. Now, the prior of the Cathedral of Durham, Turgot, who was also Margaret's spiritual advisor, wrote a hagiographical account of her life not long after her death. And he emphasises, like these other authors I've mentioned, he emphasises the changes Margaret brought with her to the Scottish court, but he does so in a very positive light. And again, let me quote the text at length. The Queen, that's Margaret, on her side, herself a noble gem of royal lineage, much more ennobled the splendour of her husband's kingly magnificence and contributed no little glory and grace to the entire nobility of the realm and their retainers. It was due to her that merchants who came by land and sea from various countries brought along with them for sale different kinds of precious wares, which were until then unknown in Scotland. And it was at her instigation that the natives of Scotland, the indigenae is the Latin, purchased from these traders clothing of various colours with ornaments to wear, so that from this period, through her suggestion, new costumes of different fashions were adopted, the elegance of which made the wearers appear to be renewed. Furthermore, she introduced so much ornamenta. Interesting what that Latin word means. I mean, decorations, I guess, ornaments, I suppose, literally, into the royal palace, that not only was it brightened by the many colours of the apparel worn in it, but the whole dwelling blazed in gold, with gold and silver. The vessels employed for serving the food and drink to the king and to the nobles of the realm were of gold and silver, or at least were gilt and plated. So Turgot, in other words, thinks that Margaret has changed the face of Scottish royalty, fundamentally, and actually for the better. I wouldn't risk putting a lot of weight on any single one of these sources. I mean, all these writers are, of course, writing, as you can imagine, you can probably guess already, with their own agendas. They're all bringing the image, the foreign queen who brings about change with her as part of their rhetorical armoury. Whether they view this change negatively or as Siegfried does, or positively, as does Turgot here. we cannot actually prove that Margaret really brought lots of merchants with her, or that Theophany really did set the fashion, or that Agnes had anything to do with men in their newly pointy shoes, which was a thing, by the way, let alone that anyone ever worried about Gertrude's private prayers. It's very difficult, isn't it, anyway, to pin down cultural influence on a single marriage. Theophany is a great case in point here. Lots of historians have tried to point to her and to link her to a Byzantinization of the Ottonian Western royal imperial court. But in a way, her marriage was as much symptom of that interest as it was a cause, right? The emperor, the rulers of Germany were fascinated with Constantinople. That's why they wanted a marriage, if you see what I mean. So it's kind of difficult to unpick the chicken and egg here. And that means it's difficult to measure her impact on Ottonian court culture. And of course, the same applies, mutatis mutandis, to all the women I've been talking about. But the point remains that for contemporaries, travelling queens were associated with a level of cultural encounter that was baked into the royal family itself. And actually, at a basic reason, I see no reason to doubt that. Women travelled, and we cannot expect that most of them, or many of them even, simply refashion themselves from scratch when they arrived at their new homes, right? That's not a realistic proposition either. And actually, sometimes we can be quite sure they didn't. It's been recently argued that Queen Margaret of Scotland treasured a special relic. It was actually a part of the Holy Cross, which she had acquired from her grandfather, the English King Edmund Ironside, and which she in turn then actually bequeathed to her son, King David. So she's got a family heirloom which goes back to her royal ancestors with her. It means a lot to her, and she passes it on to her own children in turn. So we can see her bringing her own personal priorities with her to Scotland. A 10th century Greek text, to go back a little bit, gives a sense of the impact these marriages were supposed to have. There's an archbishop and courtier named Arethas of Caesarea who praises the Byzantine emperor at the time, a man called Romanos, for arranging a marriage of his granddaughter Maria with the Bulgarians. And to quote, he says, "Through the giving out as an indissoluble bond of peace of the noble offshoot from the imperial loins," Byzantine rhetoric, "in a marriage producing fair and numerous children, marriage may progress to the point where even the barbarian nations may be domesticated through the grafting on of your kindred and may be refashioned and transformed to the virtuous life of humankind." So in other words, he's saying, this is the point, right? These marriages are meant to change the culture. That is kind of actually, that's not a side effect. That is, in fact, by design. And sure, I say this is Byzantine rhetoric, but I think it gives us a sense of the potency of these marriages. Yes, even if only the imagination. And that's a lead seal, by the way, of Maria on the background. So I've already mentioned that these 4 women I've been focusing on are just tips of the iceberg. Now, thanks to the work of an Austrian historian, not the man up there, but he's not, I'll come back to him, called Johannes Preiser-Capella, we can go a little further. So Preiser-Capella has put together an incredible map, which has really fascinated me since the time I first saw it. It's on the screen. It depicts European marital alliances from 11th through to the 13th centuries. And so you can see it on the screen. And each of those red lines is a marriage, okay, or a marriage alliance. And what that really means, by the way, is each of those red lines is a moving woman. Now, a caveat is needed before I talk more about this map. Like all maps, it is only as good as its underlying data. And in this case, the data is quite problematic, I'm afraid, because the data comes from genealogical inquiries published in volumes known as a Europäische Stammtafeln, a European kind of family trees, I guess. The complication is that these were initiated by the man you see here, a man called Wilhelm Karl, who was an aristocrat who worked on Sippenforschung for the Nazis. And he wrote a book called Das Problem der Rassenreinheit, the problem of race purity, in 1933, just a few years before his book on genealogies came out. So kind of complications here, right? In the moral complication of relying on research conducted in this period, and also the possibility that his prejudices may have shaped what he was looking for. Nonetheless, he collected a lot of information, right? And Preiser-Capella has unleashed this to give this unmatched visualization of the dense human network that's being woven across most of the continent. And most of these movements are not just one-directional, because 3 of the 4 women I focus on were themselves the products of these long-distance relationships, right? So Emperor Agnes, I said she comes from southwestern France, from Poitou. Well, that's right, but her own mother comes from Burgundy. Margaret was born in Hungary, but her mother may have been German or may have actually been from Kiev, Rus, we don't quite know, while her father was certainly English. And so it goes on. One of Agnes's own daughters, Judith, goes on to marry first a Hungarian king and then the Polish king. So Judith is often known as Judith of Swabia, but that epithet does not do justice to the border-busting nature of the families involved. I introduced you Gertrude as a Polish princess. And so she was before she became queen in Rus. But her great grandparents included the Polish king Mieszko I, but also Theophanu from Byzantium, a Czech princess called Dobrova, and Hermann, a count in the Rhineland in Germany. Right. So in other words, this is a European princess through and through. Our royal genealogies from this period are almost always man-focused, right? They're androcentric. They say, here's the father, son, and so on. But if you looked at the daughters and you did a female genealogy, it would look completely different and actually much, much more cosmopolitan. Okay, so women had travelled to become queens before the 11th century, but it seems to me that there was an acceleration of this process in the 11th century. And so my question is, what was driving that? Now, one possibility is growing anxiety about incest. I've already mentioned incest briefly. And this is actually attested by some contemporary evidence. Around 990, actually, I won't come to that. I'll come back to that later. Around 990, the new French king, Hugh Capet, wrote to Byzantium to request a bride for his son Robert. And he said, well, I've really got any choice, actually, because, quotes, because of kingship with neighbouring kings, right? I need to find, can you help me out here? Perhaps unsurprisingly, this request did not work out. Right? Please help me because we can't get anyone better is not an ideally pitched request for a Byzantine bride. Didn't net the result, but it does show us that incest was a concern. Right? He was trying to create marriage alliances outside of kind of family connections. But there's definitely more going on than just that. Not least because these marriages I've been talking about create so many links that actually they generate as many problems of incest as they solve, as we've seen with the case of Agnes and Henry, who come from different parts of Europe, right, but are in fact fairly closely related anyway. I think actually we can read the rise of these cross-border marriages as reflecting, but actually also promoting the emergence of a kind of concept of peer kingdoms, right, in Europe. So Europe is a community of kingdoms, so a kind of international politics, I guess. The growing expectation that the best bride for a king is a well-born foreign woman, but not too foreign. And here then we come back to the Europeanization of Europe I mentioned earlier. Because two things strike me about this marriage map from a modern 21st century European perspective. And the first is absences. There are several areas conspicuously missing from this network. Al-Andalus, you'll see here, Muslim Spain is not featured. And Ireland. Now, why is that? Is that because our Nazi genealogists who created the data deliberately missed them out? Perhaps. We know he did exclude some of the rulers in Kiev married to pagan nomads, the Cuman nomads in the east. He didn't include those, right? That was not part of his. And he actually didn't include Irish kings at all, in fact, in his data collection. But actually, I think his prejudices do not fundamentally change the picture. In 11th century, rulers did, in fact, tend not to marry across Christian-Muslim divide, or actually across the Irish Sea, or with pagans. Right? There are some exceptions, but really not very many. And what that means is that different parts of the European landmass were differently connected. So from the point of view of royal dynastic politics, Ireland and Al-Andalus were not really in view. Right? That's not where you get that's not where a bride comes from. So that doesn't mean, of course, these places were not part of Europe at the time, but it makes us think about it, I think. The second point is the centrality, which you might be able to see here, of Byzantium. And this is the time of when the great historian Dmitry Obolensky called it the Byzantine Commonwealth, right? The kind of the spread, the kind of the sphere of influence, I guess, radiating out from Constantinople. Because what the marriage map shows us is that the Eastern Empire was not in reality a completely separate sphere, right? It was actually as much a part of this network as anywhere else. And it's a reminder that to exclude the East, especially from the continent, from a perspective on when we think about medieval Europe, we have to think about Byzantium, basically, because this map shows that people at the time did, right? And actually the same instantly applies also to Kiev Rus, which is also very well connected into these marriages, as actually you'll have surmised from the few examples I've given. Okay, let me come towards a conclusion. I began this talk by pointing to chess to illustrate the importance of queens in 11th century Europe, in the way that the game had to be adapted when it reaches Northern Europe to take their importance into account. And I still think that's quite a telling example. But there is one important way in which this line of argument fails. Because it's actually only in the 15th century that in 15th century Spain, with the invention of queen's chess, as it was called, that the queen becomes turbocharged, right? Able, as she is now on the board, to move across the whole board in a single move. Right? Before then, she was actually restricted, like the king, in fact, to moving just one square at a time. How unlike, then, the royal courts at the Western Games seems otherwise to model, because in real life they did move all across the chessboard, right? Much often further than their royal, or nearly always further than their royal brothers, uprooting themselves in their teens or 20s to start a new life in a new land, sometimes moving across almost the entire continent. And it's worth thinking about how difficult this would have been for them as individuals, right? How challenging this would have been, and even traumatic. In late 11th century England, there's a Flemish writer named Gosselin of Saint-Bertin who talks about this phenomenon to a woman. He talks about this to a woman who's become a nun. Okay, a woman called Eve who's become a nun. But he's encouraging her in a vocation, a religious vocation, by comparing her to her choice to queens. And he says, basically, don't worry about what you're doing. It's nothing compared to what other people have done. He says, the daughters of kings and princes, raised from infancy in all delights, knowing nothing beyond the splendours and happiness of their homeland, marry into foreign nations and faraway kingdoms. They are destined to learn, oh dear, barbarous customs and strange languages, and to serve fierce lords and repugnant laws that go against nature, as, for instance, the daughter of the Margaret of Flanders married King Canute of Denmark. These girls, having once said goodbye to their parents and their land, cannot or do not want to ever see their homelands ever again, for married love supersedes all else. How many have transferred their kinship and their birthright to faraway places for the sake of earthly gains, from Gaul to Galicia and Spain, from England to Apulia and Greece, setting their hearts on transitory things? And should we be shy about migrating to eternal bliss? So, basically, if a queen can move to Apulia, you can become a nun, right? That's his argument. Now, we don't, unfortunately, know what the nun Eva thinks of this comparative argument, but I think what he does bring out, I think, is he evokes very clearly, I think, what it must have been like for the young women involved, right? But actually, I think this is important, the individual impact on these individuals. I think this is really interesting for us. But it's the collective and the cumulative effects of these movements that this talk has been chiefly interested in. Because these movements created dynastic bonds which spanned borders and gradually created a new elite across European royal kinship group. And though 11th and 12th century Europe is by no means peaceful, certainly not, this particular process was a fundamentally peaceful one. Through alliance and exchange and not colonization and war, it creates a cultural alignment which contemporaries, as we've seen, were themselves aware of. That they had different opinions about it, but they could see it happening. So I think there's a lesson here about the processes of the making of Europe, but I think there's also a lesson about the shape of Europe itself. The network these queens created was not geographically perfectly bounded. As I've said, there are a few at the edges. There are areas which are less clearly connected in. So, for example, the nomads in the steppe lands to the east, and there's actually one woman from the Caucasus who does become Byzantine empress. Still, the broad lines of this network are reasonably clear. And this marriage network map is not a map of the Latin West, that part of Europe which used Latin as the language of scholarship and prayer, because as we've seen, Byzantium and what we might call the Byzantine hinterland were also as much part of that network, as much as actually as Scotland or northern Spain. And this network is not quite the same either as the geographical concept of Europe, which existed at the time, Europa. I'll give you an illustration of that, by the way. Here is the oldest map of Europe from around early 12th century, which shows you Europe as a little area geographically bounded by the sea. Italy is on the top right and Spain is on the bottom, so it's a little bit twisted around. So there is a concept of Europe, in other words, but it's not the same as this network I've been unpicking today. What I've been talking about are these connections which reveal an important lived reality of the time, the human network which inhabits these religious and these geographical frames. And as such, I think this kinship network is as good a visualization of medieval Europe as any other, and perhaps more telling than most. As a consequence then, thinking about the Europeanisation of Europe from the perspective of emigrating queens not only challenges our perceptions of how this Europeanisation worked in the 11th century, I think it also challenges us to rethink what 11th century Europe was in the 11th, what Europe was in the 11th century. And I shall stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What a nice start to our day. Who has questions? Right. Jill.
Hello. I've actually got two questions. The first one is, they're concerns about incest. Were they purely on religious grounds, or did they have any other factors involved? And the other one was, how easy is it to get hold of a copy of that map?
Thank you very much. I say two questions about incest and the map. Incest, yes, that's an interesting question. Incest is actually a very interesting topic because it's around this time that the prohibitions of incest go to reach an unprecedented level of extension. So in other words, incest is defined... The definition of incest varies over time. Okay, so I think in most societies and cultures, though not all, marriage to your sister or your brother is regarded as incestuous and wrong. There are some exceptions to that, but not very many. Gradually, I mean, beyond that, how far it goes depends on time and place. In 11th and actually 12th century Europe, it is taken, I think, to the furthest extreme ever recorded. In that, if you share, I think it's something like 18 steps back, right? So there's literally, it is almost, this happened essentially because people said, if you're related in any way, that's incest, right? So second cousins, forget it, right? No, that's too close. So this becomes a problem actually, because what it actually means, and this is a big development in the 12th and 13th century, is that it's very easy to get a divorce. Because you just say, oh, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. It turns out that because at this time marriage was becoming indissoluble. But obviously, if it should never have happened in the first place, then that's a different question. And eventually, the Pope actually has to step back from this because it's creating. It is essentially undermining the indissolubility of marriage, which was the core principle of the time. So it is multi-religious. The underlying argument for it is, it's occasionally discussed actually, it's terribly interesting. It is really about spreading the love, in fact, is what they say. It is about saying, marriages create love and spread caritas is the word, it goes back to St. Augustine, caritas throughout society. So we need to spread that beyond existing kind of kinship groups to share the love more widely. There is a little bit of interest in genetic problems, but not very much. I think it is mostly religious. And as you can see, it is always a bit politicized. As you see, Siegfried, of course, was able to prove that Agnes and Henry were married. They got married anyway. Right, it didn't stop them. As for the map, there's a version in my forthcoming book. So.
Thank you. I was interested in the differences between the amount of cultural change that queens were showing. Is there any sort of pattern in who was most successful? Was it a case of character or nationality, or possibly the status that they had originally, that some were more successful than others, or a weaker king, or things that happened? Is there any pattern to it, or is it just happenstance, random?
Thank you. And that's a great question. It's a question I haven't really thought about, to be honest with you. And I think it would be difficult to know because the sources are, as you see, so shaped, they're stamped by the author's points they're trying to make. I think there are patterns which I think kind of reflects perceptions of prestige of the home culture, so to speak. So Byzantine empresses always, you can always expect them to have a big impact. But I think probably quite a lot would have depended on the individual, actually. And that's very difficult for us to see, of course, isn't it? Because when we know about these people, it's usually in fairly stereotyped ways. But obviously there were people like everyone, they had different personalities, and that would have made a huge difference, I'm sure. But I think it is quite difficult to see. Yeah, but thank you.
On a little bit more of an esoteric note, what comes to my mind as we're doing that, particularly that map, is sort of the tapestry, at least coming from the United States, that Europe seems to be coming together. But as much as the kings and the armies and such, it was the feminine and the woman that wove that for whatever reasons, you know, traveling here or there. And I find that really interesting. I suppose, and it's not a new thing, I suppose, but I thought it was like, wow, the true culture and heritage and what it stands for came from that. You know, in some ways, obviously monetarily and protective supported, but I find that really cool.
Thank you. And I mean, it is quite cool that you can see. I was also taken aback by that map because it kind of visualizes it very, very clearly, doesn't it? And as I say, in a historiography which is dominated by war, you kind of see a completely different side of things. I guess the only thing I would add is that although this shows queens, they are at the top. They're really the top level, right? And actually, women a little bit lower also. So elites also travelled, and there are good examples of that. A good example, Judith of Flanders. Some people come across her 11th century Judith of Flanders. She doesn't become a queen. She might have wanted to, by the way. But she marries Tostig first of in the Godwinson, right, in England, and then actually after his death, she goes to Swabia and marries a German duke, right, and so kind of moves from Flanders, right. So the queens are the best and most visible, and I think they probably travel the most, but I think actually lots of these women a little bit lower down would have travelled too. And fundamentally, I think that's probably a phenomenon of this society more generally, right? I think women often did move to marry, just queens just do it on a bigger scale. Yeah. But I think, right, it's the consequence of that which I think it's worth reflecting on.
My question follows on very directly from what you just said, because queens surely are the top of the pyramid of movement, and every young woman that moves from Poland to wherever takes with her an entourage. Those entourage will be women of stature in their new court. They will marry into the nobility, so that the pervasive effect of a queen coming from abroad is much greater than one woman.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. Oh, sorry. So, yes, each of those movements is in fact a movement of a group of people, in fact, and that will create then new networks and new connections. We're limited here by the information we have because the chroniclers generally pay most attention to the queens. But you're right, I think the queen is not just put on, the Ryanair flight to, Kyiv, and just like she'll go with an entourage with people who will often stay with her, which may be women. There may be some men as well, chaplains and so forth and so on, to help with homesickness, right? I guess, and that would be. I'm sure that was a feature for lots of people. But yes, no, there's groups of people. Not all would stay, mind you. Some might go back, right? So I think in some ways, Queens, of course, it was meant to be a one-way trip. It isn't always. There are a couple of cases when after that, I talked about some cases of where these widowed queens stay and become regents. There are a couple of cases where they go back home, which is interesting in itself, isn't it? That, they kind of still feel they are really kind of, their home is where they were born. But in most cases, they stay. It's very hard to say about the entourage, but you're absolutely right. There would have been an entourage. And yeah, so there is, which would build almost a critical mass, I guess, of people coming, yes. And I think it was that, sorry, just to interrupt briefly, I think it's that when Siegfried says that he's worried about the French introducing, he's not worried about Agnes herself modelling this, this male clothing, right? It's the people who will come with her. Right.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. So I've always been led to believe that Queen Margaret of Scotland had a high degree of literacy, that it said that she could read and write where her husband couldn't. So was literacy a thing for noble women all across Europe? And if so, where did they get their instruction from?
Thank you. Yes, okay, so Queen Margaret can read and write, and Turgot in his hagiography of her makes a great play of the distinction between her literacy and the king's illiteracy. Although it's very, he says at some points, the king loved her books, right? He couldn't read a single thing, right? But he knew that she likes them, and so out of respect for her, right, his kind of overwhelming affection for her, he also kind of likes to kind of stare at these objects out of admiration. He never learned to write himself or to read. I think. By the 11th century, a couple points here. We need to, of course, firstly, we need to break apart writing and reading. I mean, that's people often make this point. These are completely different skills. And in the Middle Ages, elites would often learn to read, but writing is a technical. That's to be able to write a lot is you have to you can get a scribe to do that for you. There are people for that. So they are completely different. So I mean, I don't think Margaret we shouldn't imagine her scribbling a diary, but she can absolutely read, and I think that's quite common actually. I think especially for queens. Partly because of the duties of being associated with the queen, with being a queen, would involve things like, I mean, you have to be pious and to pray. You also, by the way, went to embroider and do needlework and all those kinds of things as well. But the level of piety required an engagement with the written word, right? So that's why many of these queens have got, I think, they don't all survive, I think many of them would have had their own prayer books. Yeah. That might be a slight distinction with the kings. I think Turgot was making the point that the Scottish king at the time was a little bit old-fashioned, right? And so we do see kings are becoming. It's increasingly common for them to be literate in basic terms. But the other really nice example of that is I mentioned Anne of Kiev, who marries the king. Let me get this right. I think it's Henry of France in the 11th century, and we know he can't write at all. She can, and she writes in Cyrillic. And there's a lovely charter which is written where he puts his sign and she writes Anna Regina Queen Anna in Cyrillic script, which is very striking. Where they learned almost certainly from chaplains, I think queens would young women of that social status would be taught at home to read and maybe a little bit to write, but that's less important. Thank you.
Just to lower the tone slightly, what about trade? Were there trade alliances, trade marriages like this? Would merchants' wives come from different places as well?
Thank you. That's interesting. I mean, I'd have to think about that. I think in the 11th century, for the later periods, that would be more easy to investigate, right? So I'm sure Sam would be able to shed more. He can probably think of a million examples off the top of his head. For this period, it's harder to perceive because we don't have so much about that level of people. And the other complication is that being a king, as I said before, involves staying put. Merchants often obviously travelled, and we do see merchants travelling and settling in different parts of Europe, and they probably brought their families with them. So in other words, it might not be quite the same pattern. So I think most of the things I can see are political marriages rather than trade marriages, and that might be an effect of the sources, but it might not just be an effect of the sources, I think. But Sam, you ought to come in.
By the time you get to the late Middle Ages, 14th and 15th century, in fact, it is the merchant men, the boys, who are going off from, say, Florence to these backwaters in Spain and all, and we have a great correspondence of these young men and how they're homesick and the problem of learning other languages. So really, with the documentation, it's very different. Whereas with closer movement, for instance, in the Contado, in the district, the major immigrants in the later Middle Ages are women coming into the big city as domestics, as even working in the wool industry. So it's a very different pattern, and it'd be interesting to see. It's a pattern of both class and of time.
Yeah.
But thanks.
Your period's the 11th century, but were they building up to this level earlier, or did it suddenly explode in the 11th century?
So Queen's moving is the movements of queens, and these are all women, is not unprecedented. There's a new book out I was listening about yesterday about Queen Bolthild, if any of you have come across her, who is an Anglo-Saxon slave, actually, who marries and becomes the Queen of France in the very dramatic story in the 7th century. So there are these crisscrossing, and actually in the 10th century there have been quite a few Anglo-French connections. It's not, however, a given. I mean, some of you may know Charlemagne, famously the ruler of Francia, the Frankish Empire, does not marry any of his daughters. Actually, he keeps them where he can see them, right? And they all stay under his watchful eye, which has led, people have speculated about that quite a lot. So it does vary. You can see some 10th century. There are some examples. I think it heats up in the 11th century, though. I think considerably, and that is partly, as I mentioned, because of the incest But I think so it's not just that. It's also, it's also that if you are a king and you marry a local family, you're creating potentially difficult in-laws. All right, so because then you've got these people who are very close to you. Isn't it safer to have them far away, right? And that's then you can see them for Christmas, right? That's maybe an easy way of handling it. So I think there is also partly kind of we can see a strategic development here perhaps as well. But yes,
I was interested in sort of the final quote that you had up, which kind of suggests that it's a done deal. They leave and that's it. And we know that that's not always the case. But I know that later, say in the 15th century, going to a new place, marrying to a new place, wasn't sort of enough on its own. It was just the start. And we know that women would then write letters or send messages to their families back home, but also to their sisters, their aunts, their nieces, their female cousins who had married elsewhere, and keep kind of those lines of communication open even during times of war or political disagreement as kind of a backdoor to diplomacy, if you want. And I wondered, I know sources are different earlier, but whether we have any suggestion that that's going on in the 11th century as well, and that there are continuing communication networks after they've moved somewhere else.
Thank you. So we don't have as much evidence as I would like, so we don't have that kind of correspondence you've been talking about by and large. There are some exceptions, and we can occasionally see, so two examples spring to mind. So one back to Gertrude again. She lobbies quite hard. She actually writes to various people back to help her husband, actually, right? So she is definitely keeping in touch with her family, because she's writing saying, can you help, right? We're in a pickle, and what can you do about this? And of course, they do in fact give her and her husband a refuge when things get altogether too tough. But what's also interesting about Gertrude, that prayer book I mentioned stays in the family instantly, and it actually comes back. It's in Cividale, because essentially a marriage alliance takes it back. So it seems to be something which was passed on to a daughter, and so it's that then comes that comes back in. I think the other point is that Agnes. It's not quite answer your question, but I mentioned that she basically retires to her life in Rome. Right? She kind of says, I've done my bit, right? I've had enough, I'm going to retire. And who would not like to retire to Rome? I mean, yes. But she does keep those connections open. And actually for her, we do have correspondence, right? And essentially she becomes very pious and a little bit annoyed with her son. So she writes to him, the emperor, quite often saying, what are you playing at, right? And occasionally the Pope sends her on missions, or she goes on missions with the Pope. That can. We shouldn't describe all the agency in this to the Pope. I'm sure she's also has her own feelings about as we've seen with Gertrude. They can be disappointed with the decisions their children make. So we haven't got that richness, but it is just the first step. And of course, sometimes these marriages don't go well. Sometimes for political reason. One of the emperors accuses his foreign-born wife of all kinds of despicable practices, which I won't lower the tone on now. And there are various trials, and actually she then launches counter-accusations, right? So they patch things up, but actually she's the one who goes back home when he dies. So you can sometimes see it doesn't quite gel, right? It is. I don't think they had much choice about it. But they have a little bit more choice, I guess, as widows, right? If they make it through to that, they can stay or they can go, and a lot of them stay, but not all.
I was intrigued with what you were talking about with incest, and made me think about Henry VIII, of course, and how politically it actually provided. It would seem to me a very sensible way where perhaps one of the queens was barren, or he was barren and didn't know about it, but it would always seem to fall back on the queen. And as you say, they took it to ridiculous ends, but it did always provide a very easy means of ensuring heirs, which of course Henry ran into when the Pope decided not to play along, and so as a result a lot of queens lost their heads, or death was the only means of actually ensuring, heirs into the future. Was there much there on how many of these queens were replaced through annulment? Or?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, so the use of the incest kind of loophole to be rid of a spouse was used partly in cases where there was no issue, and there's also a few cases where they just hated each other, right? And that's completely clear. There's Philip Augustus, we're going a bit later now, when he met, I think it's him, his Ingeborg of Denmark, who was his bride. He took one look at her and thought, no way, no. And he said, basically, find some incest, right? I'm not, no. And this then actually that went to the Pope, and it was very complicated. And actually, he had to marry her in the end. Although, from memory, I think she died quite soon. So, for issue though, I mean, the central point is that indissolubility of marriage is a political headache, isn't it, from a dynastic point of view? And but it is increasingly carefully kind of policed. It's very difficult for a king to be rid of a spouse. She has to have done something. That's the context I mentioned, the king who tried to cast these slurs on his wife, because they have to do something so out of the pale, so beyond the pale. Sorry, you can't just say, it's not enough to say we're not having children, because the answer to that is, well, pray more. Right. So, how many of these marriages end then in? I mean, almost none of them would end in divorce. I mean, there is, of course, higher mortality rate, so I think it's that often eases that dynastic problem. But there are cases where this can lead to big political implications. Absolutely right. I mean, you can all think of one. I mean, Edward's Confessor, for example, no heirs, and that leads to all kinds of problems down the line, and there's nothing's done about that.
Cultural exchange and education. So when a queen would come in with her entourage, presumably she would also be bringing a certain amount of books, music, and possibly also changes to the way that the education in the royal court would work. So could you, I work in the 15th century, so it's a little different, but I'd be curious to know how much of that change we see in the 11th century.
Yeah, so, I mean, the case of Margaret is very clear if we can believe Turgot, who says, as I say, she brings all kinds of cultural changes, not only literacy and a taste for flashy ornaments and merchant clothing, which has never been seen in Scotland before, but also religious changes too. So in the sense of that she changes the way the Scottish church operates, right, kind of liturgically as well. You're right, because they would bring, as we mentioned already, people, but also cultural kind of artifacts, right, cultural heritage. And I've mentioned that, I guess, with the Margaret bringing her element, her little particle of the Holy Cross, which she inherited from her English, fairly distant ancestors. It would be complicated, though, and this, in a way, comes back to an earlier question, because there are already course insiders, too. Right, so it's not the case that everyone would be saying, culture, great, right? There'll be people who would be saying, well, what we do here is perfectly fine, thank you very much. We don't need, and we see a little bit of that critique in some of these letters. So people like Siegfried, who are clearly, when Siegfried of Gorse, that abbot, met Agnes of Poitou, I would love to have been there, right? So that kind of encounter, as he is kind of the culturally conservative cleric trying to push against some of these. These movements. I think it would come back to the question earlier, it would depend on the personalities and the particular context involved. I mean, also, the other point is worth remembering is that many of these women would be very young, which would make it, not all though, some were much, some were older. For example, Judith, I mentioned, although not queen, Judith of Flanders, when she remarries, she's in her 30s, so she knows how the world works, right? So that would also, the personality and the age would be difference too in how the kind of cultural package they bring is kind of processed. But you're really asking me, I think at the bottom you're asking me for kind of specific instances of, new tastes in particular items, and I'm afraid we don't have the evidence for that. We've only got these kinds of, these more general considerations and reflections that these women are bringing with them, styles and fashions and objects which are remarked on, but I can't take it further than that.
Given you say the influence Byzantium court would, or the connectivity, what was the lingua franca? I'm thinking about communications from, was it Latin or was it Greek or were both known to these educated young women?
Right. So Byzantium, I'm pleased you brought that up as well, because it also relates to an earlier point. I mean, Byzantium, going back to kind of thinking about exchanges, Byzantium often sent out brides, it received fewer, okay, because there was a sense that the emperors in Constantinople regarded themselves as rather a cut above. And there are some cases of foreign-born empresses in Constantinople, but fewer, right? Because essentially they were not completely convinced that anyone else was civilized, right? So, in terms of the education of language, I mean, it's a great point, isn't it? And it is something which our sources are oddly reticent to talk about, actually. I mean, I think coming back to that, he mentions strange languages, right? They do have to learn strange languages. I mean, that's it, though, right? I mean, for Byzantium, we know a little bit, there's a little bit more information. For example, we know that, and this is going a little bit earlier, when Charlemagne, one of Charlemagne's daughters, Rotrud, is destined or scheduled, or a marriage is arranged with Byzantium, which doesn't, by the way, happen, they send out a tutor. So she can learn some Greek before she arrives, right? So as a girl, this has already been planned, it's in the calendar, right? It's in the diary, you're going to get married in 10 years. You've got 10 years or whatever, probably less than that actually, to learn Greek, right? And I imagine that some of these marriages, they're not usually that impromptu. So actually, Henry and Agnes is possibly only a couple of years. But there would be there's usually time, right? These are not shotgun marriages, right? There is some time to think, okay, so this is where you're going, and I would imagine there'd be some effort to kind of teach them languages. But that said, it must have been difficult, frankly. They would have had almost all these queens, come back to the earlier question about literacy, all the queens from the Latin West would have had some Latin, of course. That's the language of prayer. And obviously in the Byzantine princess would, of course, known Greek, but Latin might not get you terribly far, in the small talk, if you want, I don't know, a glass of milk or something, from... that you would have had to kind of pick that up. There would be other people around, there'd be an entourage to help, but nonetheless, yeah, I think it would be difficult. But the sources never really talk about that very much. And I wonder, I don't know, I mean, people often were very good at learning many languages, right? Perhaps often today we find it's often perceived, it is the monolingualism of the Anglophone world is often complained about, isn't it? People in those days just got on and did it, I think. I think the other point is that for a queen in this period, not much public speaking would have been required. Okay, so they are meant to be around, they're meant to be intercessors and all those kinds of things, but it's not as if they have to give lots of kind of public addresses. So there's a bit of time, I guess, to learn. But thank you.
This is very fascinating. And in my very sketchy historical lack of knowledge of the area, the 11th century was when feudalism was spreading across Europe, which, in my dodgy knowledge, seems a much more male-centric structure than what had gone before. And how did was this an alternative soft power to that? And how, did it have an effect on how these things functioned?
Yeah, I think that phrase is very interesting, the kind of alternative soft power. So historians usually these days are quite cagey about feudalism because it's a capacious word which means different things in different contexts. Right. But in the sense you're talking about, there is a kind of property law, really, and that often privileges the male sons. You're absolutely right. So we're not quite at the level of the primogeniture. That's a bit later, but there is a sense that when a man dies, a propertied man, I should say, yes, then that the main estate goes to the male heirs, right? And daughters are cared for, but provided for. Sorry, but there's a so there is. You're right. There is a kind of bias in the property sense. So, and yet at the same time, of course, these networks are kind of almost in a different sphere, I guess. So I think that's almost the soft power and the kind of property are kind of working alongside each other. I think that'd be my response to that. 'Cause you're right. We do see a kind of slight hardening of the of laws around the basic inheritance, right, which does absolutely privilege men, although not completely, as I say, but yes. So I think, this is the other dimension, I guess, which is the more personal and effective and indeed family connections, which we don't see so much of because we've got a lot, the 11th century does not have much evidence, but there's a lot of evidence about property. Right? And I think that's with kings, right? We see they pass their kingdoms down to the male heirs. No queen in the 11th century rules in her own right, interestingly. You start to get that from the 12th century. It's always contested. It's never straightforward for the women. They rule as regents sometimes, 11th century, but never in their own right. But alongside that, and a bit more shadowy, but I think just as important to these networks and these affiliations and associations going on almost under the radar.
So thank you again. That was lovely. Thank you very much.